Thank you very much. Wow.
When Donald Trump took the stage on election night, he seemed almost taken aback.
It is now clear that we've achieved the most incredible political thing. Look what happened. Is this crazy?
But the president-elect did not waste any time in moving to reshape the government.
President-elect Donald Trump is building his administration, announcing who will be in charge of America's border policy.
This morning, President-elect Trump signaling a major move on immigration, saying he will declare a national emergency and use military assets for a mass deportation program.
Trump has picked several immigration hardliners for top posts.
And has filled key roles on energy and the environment with supporters of oil and gas production who've pledged to slash regulations.
It's going to be interesting to see, the unraveling of some of these regulations when you're at EPA. We're going to watch very closely to see, what you look to tackle first.
Today, the first of 2 episodes on how the new administration could affect Georgia. This week, we look at immigration and the environment. I'm WABE Politics reporter Sam Gringlas.
I'm WABE Politics reporter Rahul Bali, and this is Plugged In, a WABE Politics podcast. So we begin today's episode with WABE immigration reporter Emily Wu Pearson. Emily, welcome back to the show.
Thank you, Sam and Rahul.
So Emily, let's start with those news headlines we heard at the beginning of the show. Lots of talk about mass deportations. We're still learning more about what this could look like, how logistically it could be carried out. But give us some context. Can you tell us what we know about the undocumented population in Georgia?
Sure. Yeah, there's no official count of undocumented people in the U.S., but the nonprofit Migration Policy Institute made some estimates based off the Census Community Survey. Those estimates show there could be around 400,000 undocumented people living in Georgia.
So Georgia has detention centers run by Immigration and Customs Enforcement. I did some reporting on private detention facilities during the first Trump administration. I know some of these Georgia facilities are owned by private companies. Can you explain a little bit about what that footprint looks like in Georgia specifically?
Yeah. All of the immigration detention centers in Georgia are actually run by private prison companies. So Georgia currently has 2. Both are in the southern part of the state. Stewart Detention Center is operated by CoreCivic, which is a private prison company. Folkestone ICE Processing Center is operated by Geo Group. Together, they can detain about 3,000 people. They're about 3,000 beds. Sometimes they go over the thresholds if there's an emergency. Actually, during the first Trump administration in Georgia, there was an additional detention center, Irwin Detention Center, and that has since stopped detaining immigrants after there was documented medical abuse against women there.
Emily, I'm curious how widespread deportations would affect one of Georgia's biggest industry, the agriculture industry.
Yeah, a lot of people are looking at this question, and there's a few ways to approach it. So the nonprofit American Immigration Council estimates that at least 5% of the state's labor force is undocumented. So speaking labor-wise, there's just a simple loss of workers. Now I'm going back into the archives a little bit to look at dollar amounts. In Georgia, there was a law called the Illegal Immigration Reform and Enforcement Act of 2011, and that cracked down on employment of undocumented people, and it eventually faced some legal challenges. UGA did a study of that law's effect on the economy and found that there was a 5,000 worker shortage in agriculture, which resulted in a $140 million loss in the industry in the year after that law went into effect, so 2012.
What about recipients of DACA, or Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals? These are people who were brought here illegally by their parents when they were little kids, but have gotten legal status under this program. What has Trump said about this program, and how many people are affected here in Georgia?
In Trump's first term, he actually tried to end DACA, but was ultimately blocked by the courts. People are bracing for him to do much of the same in his second term. And even though he hasn't exactly indicated his plans for DACA, the people he's appointed to key immigration roles indicate that they do hope to end the program. As for Georgia, there are almost 34,000 people eligible for DACA here, and census analysis, again from the American Immigration Council, shows 95% of those eligible for DACA are already working in the state of Georgia.
Now, what about asylum seekers who have come to the country with temporary protected status, or TPS, from countries like Afghanistan, Venezuela, Haiti, Ukraine? What's that population like in Georgia? And also, what has Trump said about his plans for these groups of people?
Yeah, TPS is a really interesting part of immigration law. It's been around since 1990. It was an H.W. Bush initiative. It allows for migrants coming from countries with extraordinarily bad conditions, like war or famine. It allows them to come to the U.S. and stay here while immigration processes their cases. Usually, if you're trying to get into the U.S., you have to apply from your origin country. When they come and ask for asylum through TPS, they are able to get a work permit and they will not be deported. So there was a congressional report that came out this March, and it showed Georgia was home to nearly 30,000 people with TPS. Trump said that he would end the program and deport all of the TPS recipients immediately.
So, Emily, I want to ask you about Trump's picks so far for key immigration posts. South Dakota Governor Kristi Noem for Department of Homeland Security, former ICE official, Tom Homan as border czar, and Stephen Miller as deputy chief of staff. Both Noem and Miller campaigned for Trump in Georgia during the 2024 election cycle. Here's Miller at a Trump rally at Georgia Tech in October.
We could be a country that doesn't let illegal aliens violate our borders and kill and murder American children.
Emily, what do these picks tell you about the direction of immigration policy in Georgia in the 4 years to come?
Yeah, Trump's picked an array of people who follow his general opinion on immigration and would assemble to help facilitate his promised mass deportations. Noem has personally offered to drive razor wire to Texas to put along the border. And Miller is the architect behind separating children and families at the border. A Department of Homeland Security investigation actually found the Trump administration pushed that through, knowing it didn't have the technology or resources to reunite these kids and their families. So these folks advising Trump on immigration will likely pursue goals to greatly reduce or even halt immigration to the U.S. for at least a little while. So to level set a little bit, alternatives that Democratic politicians and immigration advocates have called for include hiring more staff to process immigration cases and hiring more immigration judges to speed up asylum and deportation proceedings, more of trying to renovate that immigration process. So Georgia state senators have actually asked Tom Homan for advice before on how to handle interstate travel of undocumented immigrants. At a Senate subcommittee meeting in 2023, he shared more than a dozen suggestions, and so here are a few.
Enact laws making it a crime to transport, conceal, induce an illegal alien. Prohibit illegal aliens from receiving driver's licenses, license plates, business licenses. Collect data and publish crimes committed by illegal aliens. Let your taxpayers know how much time your law enforcement has been tied up arresting and prosecuting illegal aliens.
And just to fact check a little bit, undocumented people in Georgia cannot get driver's licenses. And actually, since this conversation with Homan, Georgia has passed a law requiring law enforcement to report undocumented arrest numbers.
So, Emily, what are you hearing from immigration lawyers and advocates in Georgia?
These attorneys and advocates in Georgia are taking Trump at his word about mass deportation just to be prepared, even though there are huge logistical and financial barriers to mass deportation. Many attorneys and advocates have been through a Trump term before. So I spoke to attorney Priyanka Bhatt with the advocacy and nonprofit Project South, and here's what she said.
We are preparing for any possible scenario. I think, it's a legitimate concern looking into how local law enforcement are collaborating with immigration.
And in that, she's referencing Georgia's new law requiring state and local police to join a federal program called 287G that allows ICE to deputize local law enforcement to take on some immigration duties.
So much to follow in the months and years ahead. Tracking all of it will be WABE's Emily Wu Pearson. Emily, thank you so much for your reporting.
Thank you, Sam and Rahul. Good to be on your show.
And we'll be right back. This is Plugged In, a WABE Politics podcast. Welcome back to Plugged In. Now let's turn to the environment and our in-house expert WABE environment reporter, Marisa Mecke. Marisa, welcome to the show.
Hi, Rahul.
One of the hallmarks of the Biden presidency is the Inflation Reduction Act, which was heralded as the most sweeping climate policy ever passed in the United States. Marisa, remind us what is in it and what could potentially be rolled back under the Trump administration.
The Inflation Reduction Act is, as you said, sweeping. It includes mostly tax credits. That's the way that it functions for everything from home energy efficiency upgrades to electric vehicles and all sorts of climate and energy related sustainable upgrades. And it also includes stuff like solar panels and clean energy production, and also some not climate items like prescription drug costs. But there have been millions of dollars on the line in Georgia, whether it's tax credits for individuals like Georgia taxpayers or federal incentives for companies like the Hyundai Meta plant outside Savannah. But Trump says he wants to repeal any unspent funds under the IRA.
Well, what about all the Republican voting areas of Georgia that have benefited from projects like new solar or electric vehicle production? You know, as you talk about tax credits, we're not talking just about companies, but also those $7,500 tax credits for people who purchase EVs, which is helping boost this growing industry. Does the effect on jobs in some of these red-leaning areas insulate some of the projects from rollbacks potentially?
That's a great question. And, party lines don't necessarily make anyone immune to rollbacks. And the Trump administration does say that it wants to wholesale end the Inflation Reduction Act or any of the unspent funds, the things that they can't roll back. And this is where some Republicans are finding themselves in a really tricky position. Buddy Carter, who is a representative in South Georgia, is a perfect example. His district includes the Hyundai Meta plant, which has been a huge sustainable manufacturing win for the state of Georgia, but he's also been a really staunch critic of the Inflation Reduction Act, and he also signed on to a letter earlier this year with 17 other Republican legislators asking Trump not to roll back parts of the IRA, specifically because they've supported massive green manufacturing in their districts. So they kind of understand that tension is there. So, if the Trump administration wanted to protect these projects, which it hasn't really spoken publicly on, they would really need to use a scalpel with the IRA and figure out how to select exactly those parts. But again, we haven't really heard if that's a thing that the Trump administration wants to pursue or not.
So the Environmental Protection Agency is charged with regulating air and water quality. Trump's pick to lead the agency is former New York Congressman Lee Zeldin. He recently spoke to Fox News.
So day one and the first 100 days, we have the opportunity to roll back regulations.
Marisa, what are you watching for at the EPA as it relates to the state of Georgia?
So I'm watching out for, Trump and his EPA administrator pick have their eyes on deregulation and how environmental policy can shift to better serve businesses. And really in Georgia, I'm looking for, one of the things that's coming up more and more often is data centers and Bitcoin mining. In recent years, they have gobbled up energy and water, and they've really negatively impacted a lot of low-income and communities of color and rural areas. And the reason I'm really interested in this is that they're areas that states are looking to regulate more and to really, because they're so new. Georgia, in this last legislative session, had legislation that was looking to kind of answer big questions about these. But again, they're so new and they're so resource insensitive that communities really are looking to figure out how we're going to make rules about them. So a big question is whether the EPA is going to be willing or interested in regulating this new and growing industry. It's a little outside of their normal realm of work, but it's also something that communities are experiencing, environmental harm from. But again, under this new administration, they might not really be interested in pursuing that. And I'm also keeping an eye on air quality rulemaking. The EPA, especially under Biden, was poised to increase regulations that the agency says would prevent over 4,000 deaths by 2032, as well as over 800,000 cases of asthma symptoms. And this would be by regulating fine particulate matter air pollution, so the ones that get closest, deepest into your lungs. But Zeldin, as a congressman, voted against improved air quality measures, so his track record says he might not really be super interested in pursuing that line of regulation. And, of course, I'll also be following water protections and clean drinking water efforts by the EPA, too.
Okay, so, Marisa, you kind of inferred it there in your answer. Does this mean more decisions on environmental regulation will be left up to the states?
I think that, obviously, as our politics team, y'all can talk to the broader themes of Trump wanting things to be left up to the states more, but the answer is yes. States have always had the option to pursue more protective environmental policy than federal minimums. So what the EPA does is it really gives us a lot of the minimum standards of like, this is the bottom floor of what would be healthy for communities. And Georgia tends to usually stick with those federal requirements. It doesn't really exceed them and go for more protective measures. Trump's modus operandi in his last administration wasn't to make any like new or ambitious environmental rules, but really to deconstruct and roll back regulations and the agencies that, administer them. And without federal regulations to fall back on, states will have to decide themselves how they want to protect their resources at the local and state level and their communities.
So let's talk about the Supreme Court for a minute. Recently, the court ruled in a landmark case known as Chevron, which basically gave a lot more regulatory authority to the courts instead of agencies. What will that mean in practice in the Trump era?
The EPA, USDA, and, similar agencies really rely on a workforce of civil servants who have specialized scientific knowledge. These are experts in their fields. And when a statute is unclear, historically, agency regulators were kind of the de facto people to decide tricky questions. But after the Chevron decision, those questions instead can go to the courts. And that means regulations could be more grounded in what happens in the courtroom rather than actual scientific evidence decided by, these experts. And the Supreme Court in recent years has been a really hard playing field for environmentalists. They've also seen some massive losses in air quality regulations in EPA versus West Virginia, wetland protections in the Sackett case, and, others that were handed down from the Supreme Court after Trump's first administration brought on new justices. So environmentalists might have their hackles raised a little bit, knowing that the court system, as opposed to agency experts, recently haven't been as forgiving to their causes.
Now, Trump's picks to lead the Energy Department and the Interior Department are known as being friendly to the oil and gas industry. Marisa, talk to me about what the new administration might mean for clean energy and efforts like nuclear and solar that have been growing here in Georgia.
So Trump's really been moving forward with a drill baby drill mentality, and his cabinet picks show that he's not only unserious about climate change and renewable energy, but that he wants to double down on fossil fuels. And it is important to note that domestic oil production was at its highest during the Biden administration, despite their climate-friendly policies. So it's not like the U.S. has really been turning away from oil in a significant way. But also, Trump's top department heads are staunch fossil fuel advocates who've demonstrated that they don't really have interest in, nuclear and solar and the things that have been growing in Georgia. Doug Bergman, North Dakota's governor, is up for the Secretary of Interior position, and Chris Wright, chief executive at Liberty Energy, the world's second largest fracking company and a staunch climate change denier, is tapped to lead the Department of Energy. Solar and EV business is growing strong in Georgia, and it isn't going to grind to a halt under Trump. The major facilities have already been built. A lot of people have already taken advantage of tax credits to make their homes and businesses run on renewable energy. But, funding, support, and technical assistance to grow these industries is going to brace for some really rough waters. In Georgia, it could look like renewable-focused businesses no longer receiving federal funding or tax credits that make them, viable, financially. And it could also look like Trump rolling back federal rules that are meant to kind of force states to start slowly reducing greenhouse gas emissions and pollution, which means at the state level, our energy regulators, the Public Service Commission, might not feel as pressed to shutter coal plants or pursue more sustainable, diverse energy mix through solar or nuclear.
So, Marisa, how are environmental groups in Georgia responding?
So, they're not thrilled. A lot of these people worked through the last Trump administration, and they still to this day highlight how the legacy of those rollbacks are still impacting Georgia. For example, the Okefenokee Swamp and the mine that's planned to be built near it has been kind of the major headline-grabbing environmental news in Georgia. And, that happened because of loss in wetland protections under the Trump administration. And people are also worried about updated air quality regulations not getting put through. So, Gil Rogers is the director for the Georgia office of the Southern Environmental Law Center, and he says that the outcome of the election still doesn't change the big priorities at the state level for what, he's working on. Here's what he told me after the election.
We've got our work cut out for us no matter who is, in control in Washington, and we want to stay focused on making sure that those protections are not lost for you and me and for all the other Georgians that expect clean and healthy water and air.
He also says, this isn't the first time environmental groups have weathered presidential administrations that have been less than progressive on environmental issues. And, he says that their work is more important now than ever.
WABE environment reporter Marisa Mecke, thank you so much for your reporting.
Thank y'all.
And that's it for this edition of Plugged In, a WABE Politics podcast.
We're off next week for Thanksgiving. We'll return on Friday, December 6th, with the second part of this series, looking at what Trump's second term could mean for Georgia. We'll focus on health and housing.
And we're thankful this week and every week for producer Brendan Rivers and our managing editor, Alex Helmick. Have a restful Thanksgiving.